This happened about 7 years ago, in early March back when I was 20. My two closest friends, Ryan, who was 22, and Cole, who had just turned 19, were both preparing to leave for different branches of the military, and there was this understanding between us that things were about to change in a way that had never really happened before. Ryan was shipping out first, Cole later that year, and I was the only one still undecided, stuck somewhere between wanting to follow them and not knowing if I could. We had grown up together, so those last few weeks felt like the final stretch. And that night, we were at Ryan's older cousin's place, out in rural Pennsylvania, doing nothing in particular but killing time. Well, around midnight, Cole suggested we head out to a river he knew, near an old railroad line. And when he mentioned the place was creepy at night, that alone was enough to get us moving. The area itself had a very specific layout, and it's something I've replayed in my head more times than I can count. There was a narrow back road running along a shallow valley, and just below the road was a strip of wood, maybe 30 feet deep, that opened directly onto a set of railroad tracks. The tracks ran perfectly parallel to a wide, slow-moving river, with a steep, gravel slope dropping down from the rails to the water's edge. There were no crossings nearby or side tracks, no signs of recent activity, just a single line cutting through the landscape. We parked along the road, grabbed a couple of flashlights, and made our way down through the trees. The ground was uneven and damp under our boots. It was cold, so we built a small fire near the riverbank and sat around it, chatting. Just about stupid memories, old stories. There was this strange mix of excitement and unease hanging over the conversation. Like we all knew this was one of the last nights we'd have like this, but no one wanted to say it aloud. We couldn't have been there more than 15 minutes when we heard a man yelling somewhere out in the darkness. It wasn't words exactly, we really couldn't make it out, just sharp and strained noises that echoed through the valley, in a way that made it impossible to tell where it was coming from. All three of us stopped talking at the same time, and the mood changed immediately. Ryan laughed at first, brushing it off, saying it was probably just someone messing around, but then the sound came again, longer this time, and there was something in it that didn't feel like a joke. We swept our flashlights through the trees, across the tracks, out towards the river, but there was nothing there. No other people, no sign that anyone else was near us. The place didn't just feel quiet. It felt ominous, like we'd walked into something we weren't supposed to be a part of. We put the fire out without really discussing it and sat there in the dark listening, waiting for the sound to return. For a while there was nothing but the faint movement of the river. Then we felt it before we heard it. A subtle vibration that travels through the ground and into your chest. A train was coming. Given where we were, the only real option was to climb the slope back up the tracks, even though it was steep enough that every step felt like it might slide out from under us. We scrambled up, using our hands as much as our feet, loosening stones falling beneath us. About halfway up, the yelling came again. This time it was closer, close enough that it felt like it should have been right on top of us. But when we stopped and looked, there was nothing there. No figure or movement, just darkness pressing in on all sides. We reached the tracks just as a light appeared in the distance, rounding the bend. It was bright, cutting through the darkness, and then we noticed the smoke, thick clouds rising above the engine, which didn't make any sense at all. This wasn't a time or place where you'd expect to see something like that, but in the moment none of us questioned it. Fear has a way of pushing logic aside, and we dropped down beside the rail, flattening ourselves against the ground, waiting for it to pass. The vibration grew stronger, the light more intense, the smoke heavier, and then the yelling came again right beside us, not ahead or behind, but right there, as if whoever was making that sound was standing just outside of reach. All three of us snapped our heads up at the same time, scanning the darkness, but there was still nothing there. And then, just like that, it was over. The train was gone. not fading into the distance, but gone as if it had never been there at all. The light vanished, the vibration stopped, the smoke disappeared, and the silence that it left felt unnatural. We stayed there trying to process exactly what happened. Cole was the first to say anything, asking if it had happened, but no one answered his question. We crossed the tracks without another word, moved back through the woods and decided to sleep in the car rather than risk driving those winding roads with our heads still spinning. By morning everything felt different. Sunlight has a way of doing that. We joked about it, came up with some explanations, maybe a maintenance vehicle or fog playing tricks on us, and maybe we were just tired. And eventually, it became one of those stories that we just sort of forgot about. About 4 years later, I was back in town visiting and ended up stopping at the local museum. One display focused on railroad accidents, and there was a black and white photo labeled Valley Line Disaster 1911. According to the description, a steam locomotive had derailed along a river just outside of town, killing several workers. One detail stood out more than anything else, a note mentioning that witnesses had reported seeing a man shouting frantically just before the crash, as if he had been trying to warn the crew. But it wasn't just the story that got to me, it was the photo itself. In the image you could see the wreckage near the river, twisted metal and debris scattered along the tracks, and standing off to the side were 3 figures, blurry and indistinct but clearly there. 3 young men who were not dressed like workers or rescuers, but just near the rails. Underneath the photo was a note from the archivist saying those figures weren't identified and didn't appear in any other records related to the incident. I stood there for a long time, staring at the picture, because I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen that exact spot before. Not just the location, but the angle, the position, the way the tracks curved along the river. And then something else came back to me, something I hadn't thought about since that night. Right before the train disappeared, just for a split second, I thought I saw something across the tracks. 3 shapes lying low to the ground, almost like reflections of us. At the time I dismissed it as shadows or my eyes playing tricks on me. But standing there in that museum looking at the photograph, I wasn't so sure anymore. Sometimes I think about that night, and wonder if what we experienced wasn't just something strange passing through, but something overlapping 2 moments separated by more than 100 years, brushing up against each other for a brief moment. And if that's true, then the part that sticks with me the most isn't that we saw something that we couldn't explain. It's that the possibility for a brief moment, someone from the deep past, saw us too. My first ghostly encounter was only a moment, and if I'd have been alone, I'd have taken it as just a trick of the light. My friend and I were traveling on the buses between our houses. We were both looking out the window enjoying the view, honestly feeling a bit bored. We passed over a bridge just above some train tracks. For just the moment it took for the bus to pass the bridge, I saw her, the white lady. And she was see-through. She looked like mist. She had a long gown on, and either long white hair or a veil, and she was just standing there right on the tracks facing ahead. I don't remember anything about her, any specific features or anything, and assumed she was a bride, but not right at the moment. I just remember turning slowly to my friend, and she was doing the exact same thing and looked white as a sheet. "Did you just see that?" I asked, and she nodded. We both shivered and looked back, but you couldn't see the tracks unless you were on the bridge. I let her tell me what she'd seen and it matched. We were both stunned and thoroughly spooked. Last night my partner and I were taking a train home from a night out in London. It was late and we live in the country, so there aren't many towns or bright lights on the route, which essentially turns the windows into black mirrors. We had just departed the last station before our stop, and our car was empty aside from ourselves. I had turned to the window and saw the reflection of a person walking down the aisle towards our backs, and it appeared that the person had settled into the seat directly across the aisle from us. When I turned to look at the person in the seat, no one was there. I stood up and looked around the car. Still only my partner and I. It was a quick glance of the person, but long enough to get a rough description. Today I couldn't seem to shake what I saw and did some research. I found a very brief article about a person that was hit by a train just outside of the train station we had departed on the same route, when I saw the figure in that reflection. The weirdest part was, the person had died 7 years earlier on that exact date. I was 22 when this happened, during a semester abroad in southern Austria. Even now I struggle to explain it in any logical way. I've never been someone who believed in ghosts or anything paranormal, so at the time I treated the whole thing like a joke. There was a place everyone talked about, something students referred to as the old station. It was supposedly an abandoned train station far beyond the edge of town, past a stretch of rusted tracks that hadn't been used in decades. And, like most local legends, it came with its fair share of stories, which I dismissed completely. Well, one evening my friends Lena and Marcus convinced me to go with them. We were bored and honestly looking for something to do, and the walk there already felt somewhat unsettling. The tracks were nearly swallowed by weeds, and the deeper we went, the more quiet everything became. When the structure finally came into view, I immediately felt uncomfortable. The building stood alone, covered in layers of graffiti and colors dull and weathered. Empty spraying cans were littered near the entrance, but inside was what really caught my attention. The floor was littered with objects that looked personal. Old suitcases, damp books, photographs. None of it looked like random trash. It looked as if it had been left behind completely on purpose. We tried to laugh it off, making comments about teenagers hanging out there, or someone staging it for dramatic effect. But as we walked deeper into the station, the atmosphere began to change. An inexplicable tension crept in, and without realizing, I began to bite my nails. Marcus kept clearing his throat, and Lena grew unnaturally quiet. It was as if anxiety had appeared out of nowhere, spreading through all of us at the same time. At one point, Lena suddenly stopped walking and started towards the far end of the platform. She quietly said she thought someone was standing there. I looked, but saw nothing except shadows in the curve of the corridor. Marcus teased her gently, insisting she was imagining things, yet none of us felt comfortable enough to linger. We eventually circled towards the tracks behind the building, and that's when we noticed a torn jacket lying near the rails. Beside it was a thick clump of hair, not scattered strands, but a dense handful that immediately made my stomach turn. The sight of it triggered something instinctive. Marcus reacted first, muttering that we should leave. The nervousness that had been building suddenly changed into something far more palpable. And that was the moment we became aware of the footsteps. Not to mention we weren't moving. It was as if someone were dragging their feet across the gravel. The sound came from behind us, close enough to feel immediate, and we turned around expecting to see another person. And there, a man stood on the platform. He appeared middle-aged, but there was something deeply unnatural about him. His clothes looked faded, almost drained of color, his face expressionless, and what unsettled me the most were his eyes, which didn't reflect like normal eyes do. They seemed dull, yet directly fixed on us. None of us spoke, but the fear at that point had become too great and we ran. The gravel moved violently beneath our feet as we sprinted along the tracks. My heart pounded so hard it blurred my vision. But what scared me was the sound that followed. The footsteps continued behind us, steady and unhurried, and I remember glancing back briefly expecting to see the man chase us. He wasn't running, but he was closer than he should have been. He seemed nearer without ever moving in a way my brain could properly process, and the panic became absolute. We didn't stop until we reached the road, gasping for breath. When we finally turned back, there was nothing there. Weeks later, I casually mentioned the abandoned station to an older bartender. His reaction was unsettling. He looked at me with discomfort before telling me there had never been a station at that location. According to him, decades ago there had only been tracks, and over the years several people had disappeared along that stretch. I still don't consider myself someone who believes in the paranormal, but I never have been able to explain what I saw that night. I'm not someone who believes in ghosts or anything paranormal, and I've taken the subway my whole life without ever experiencing something I couldn't explain. But this happened a few months ago on Line A, and it stuck with me, and I can't really explain it. For context, I live in Buenos Aires, and am very familiar with Line A. Like most people here, I grew up hearing about Pasco Sur and Alberti Norte, the old stations that were closed decades ago, but whose platforms are still there. The trains pass through them without stopping. In Buenos Aires, these stories about the sub there have always circulated, even amongst people who don't believe in the paranormal. There's a long-standing rumor that the La Crosse station on Line B was built over an old cemetery, and some workers claim to have seen translucent figures on security cameras late at night. On Line A, many people talk about the stretch between Pasco and Alberti, where legend says construction workers died. Some passengers insist the train lights occasionally go out at that section, and that silhouettes can sometimes be seen near the tracks. Then there are the well-known half-abandoned stations, Pasco Sur and Alberti Norte. Pasco Sur was closed and only exists on the side, serving trains towards Plaza de Mayo, while Alberti Norte remains closed to passengers but is still used for technical purposes, mainly related to supplying electricity. I always assumed these stories were just urban folklore, until something happened to me on Line A that I still can't explain. There are always jokes and urban legends about them being ghost stations, but I never paid much attention to that. That night, I was heading home fairly late, close to midnight. The car wasn't empty, and nothing felt unusual at first. At some point though, I noticed the lights dim slightly, not just turn off but drop in brightness, for a moment before returning to normal. That's common enough underground, so I didn't think much of it. After it happened again a short time after, I happened to look out the window. We were passing one of the closed platforms. I didn't immediately register which one, but the lighting seemed weaker than usual. That's when I saw what I assumed were maintenance workers. There were two figures standing near a column completely still. My first reaction was entirely rational. Closed platforms still get occasional staff after all. What caught my attention was their appearance. Their clothing didn't look like modern working gear. It wasn't theatrical or exaggerated, but just subtly outdated. As the train moved, one of the figures shifted slightly, and for a brief moment I could see the face more clearly. I can't describe anything dramatic or grotesque. It simply looked wrong in a way that's hard to articulate. Too pale under the dim lighting, maybe, or difficult to focus on properly. Almost immediately after that, the lights inside the car flickered once. I glanced away from the window reflexively, and when I looked back, the platform was gone. Just the tunnel again. At that point, I assumed I had misinterpreted shadows or reflections, which is easy to do with glass and uneven lighting. What unsettled me more than what I saw was the general atmosphere in the car afterwards. Several passengers seemed tense. No one spoke, but there was noticeable restlessness, people glancing at the windows, shifting in their seats. It felt like a shared discomfort rather than my own imagination running wild. A man sitting next to me then made an offhand comment about people often feeling uneasy near those closed stations at night. When I asked if he'd ever noticed anything unusual himself, he attributed it to reflections and visual distortions underground, which honestly sounds reasonable. A few moments later, I looked towards the opposite window in the reflection, and I thought I saw someone standing in the aisle behind us, a tall figure with long hair and light-colored clothing. It was clear enough for me to turn around immediately, but the aisle was empty, and when I looked back at the glass, nothing was there. The man beside me noticed my reaction and didn't seem alarmed. He said something along the lines of, "Seeing isn't the strange part, it's when other people see them too." When the train slowed in the next exit, I got off, mostly because I felt uncomfortable and wanted some distance from the situation. As I stepped onto the platform and the doors closed, I glanced back inside the car. My seat was empty. The man was gone. There was no obvious movement suggesting he had gotten off earlier, and no one nearby resembled him. I remember finding that odd, but assuming I simply hadn't noticed him stand up. Then I looked at the station sign, Alberti, which means we had just passed Alberti Norte. Since then I haven't experienced anything similar, and I'm still inclined to believe there are rational explanations. But I've taken Line A countless times before and after, and something about that sequence of events felt distinctly different from the usual your eyes are playing tricks on you. What I can't shake is how many people in the car appeared uneasy at the same time, even before anything was said. And now whenever the lights dim, even slightly near Pasco or the Alberti line at night, I will notice when people instinctively look out the windows, almost like they're checking to see if they'll see something. This happened in the 70s, which tells you how old I am. At the time, I had gotten a job as part of the London Underground. I had got friendly with a number of the drivers, and there would be times when I would sit at the front with them and chat while doing work. It was on one of these occasions, late at night, that me and a driver buddy were making our way. I can't remember which route exactly, but as we were driving along, we were passing a disused station. So, for context, there were stations on the London Underground that were inevitably closed due to either low passenger numbers or a few other reasons. I can't remember which station it was. I have a suspicion it might have been City Road Station, but I could very well be wrong. The point is, these stations were not illuminated at the time, and all that remained was the ghost of their platform. As we were driving along, we had the headlights turned on the train. We were discussing something, and the moment we came through the part where the abandoned station was, I saw what appeared to be a woman dressed in olden-style clothing standing at the station platform. I blinked and she was still there, and we passed her by in a flash. When I turned to look out the window to see if she was still there, I couldn't see anyone. This troubled me. As I said, this station was disused. I don't even think there was a way to reach it. So when I turned to my friend to ask him if he'd seen what I'd seen, the look on his face said it all. He had indeed seen the phantom passenger, and I waited for him to speak. But when he didn't, I piped up, "So, did you, Yeah, I saw it all right," he replied. I asked if it was his first time, and he admitted he has. My friend, although we never really brought up the paranormal before, turns out was a staunch skeptic and had never believed in such things, and was an ardent Christian, and thought this was ungodly. Remember, this was a while ago. When I asked him to explain what we'd seen, he said he didn't know how, and didn't want to think about it. After some time, I asked around, and a few other conductors had seen phantoms on the lines, not necessarily in abandoned or disused stations, but also on the tracks themselves, or in the depots at night. A real mix and interesting amount of stories. All the same, it left me profoundly freaked out. I did only glimpse her for 2 or 3 seconds, but that was enough to make me a believer that there must be something more after we die. Recently, my boyfriend and I moved out of a garage apartment in Houston that honestly felt like a steal for how good the space was. It wasn't huge or anything, but it had privacy and just enough separation from the main house to feel like our own little space. We lived there comfortably, never really questioning anything about the place beyond its quirks and older properties. After we moved out, our landlord asked us to help line up a sublet, which we did without much thought. Everything seemed straightforward until I got a call from the new tenant that blindsided me. They sounded angry, and immediately asked why I hadn't told them there'd been a death in the house. I was confused. I genuinely had no idea what he was talking about. I told them exactly that I hadn't been told anything like that, and that if it were true, it was something the landlord should have disclosed, not me. But they kept going, explaining that they were practicing Catholics, and that this kind of thing was very serious to them, especially because they believed strongly in the possibility of demonic attachment or possession tied to violent deaths. And that was when something in the back of my mind began to stir. Up until that moment, I had never connected anything unusual to the apartment. But once the idea was planted, 2 specific incidents came rushing back, both of them strange enough at the time but easy to dismiss when they happened. The first was the cat. One morning we woke up and found a stray cat laying dead in our driveway. It hadn't been hit by a car or anything like that. There was no obvious explanation for how it died, and the way it was positioned made it feel deliberate, as if it had been placed there. I remember thinking it was disturbing but brushed it off as the work of some random unstable person. From where I'm from, that kind of thing isn't unheard of, and it felt easier to chalk it up to that than sit with how unsettling it actually was. The second incident was the one that really stuck with me, even before all of this. I had come home late one night after a shift at a bar, sometime in the early hours of the morning, when everything was nice and quiet. As I pulled up, I saw someone standing at our front door. It was a small, older woman, maybe around 4'10", and she was trying to unlock the door with a set of keys. At first, I neither felt scared nor confused. I assumed she must be connected to the main house somehow, maybe a relative of the neighbors who had gotten turned around. So I walked up and said something like, "Hey, this is actually my place, are you looking for someone?" She turned and looked at me with this expression I can only describe as confusion, like I was the one who didn't belong there. She stared at me for a moment and then slowly turned and walked towards the main house without another word. And I stood there trying to process it, before going inside and locking the door behind me. At the time, I convinced myself it was just some neighbor's relative with memory issues or something similar. It felt like the most reasonable explanation. But after that phone call, I wasn't sure anymore. I reached out to the new tenants and asked them to send me whatever they had found about the alleged death. I won't go into too much detail for privacy reasons, but what they sent was enough to make my stomach drop. The garage apartment had originally been built for the homeowner's elderly mother, and she had been killed there. Not passed away naturally, but violently killed in her bedroom. There were details about the case that made it even more unsettling, particularly the timing and the location. The property was close to the railroad track, and based on when it happened, there was speculation that the crime could have been connected to Ángel Reséndiz, also known as the Railroad Killer, who was active in that area around the time, and was known for targeting homes near train lines. Reading that made everything feel surreal. The dead cat, the woman at the door, the fact she had keys, or at least something she thought were keys, and the way she looked at me like I was in her space. I still don't consider myself someone who jumps to paranormal conclusions, Every now and then I can come up with rational explanations for each individual event if I try hard enough. Someone could have dumped the cat, the woman could have been confused or dealing with something mental, or simply being at the wrong house. But it's harder to ignore how those moments feel when you look at them together, knowing what might have happened there before we ever moved in. I lived in that apartment for months and never once felt like I was in danger, never felt watched, and never had that overwhelming sense of dread usually described in stories like this. Once, while riding the Mexico City Metro, I swear I saw someone standing on the tracks between stations. This wasn't one of those maybe I imagined it moments. The train had slowed just enough, and through the window I could clearly make out a figure standing in the tunnel. It caught me so off guard I physically tensed. The guy next to me noticed immediately. What made me uneasy wasn't just that he noticed, but the way he looked. He had an awful, unsettling appearance, not in an exaggeration horror movie way, but in a deeply uncomfortable, hard-to-explain way. His face seemed off, like his features didn't quite sit where they should, and his skin looked unnaturally pale in the fluorescent lighting. His eyes looked empty, and when he smiled, it didn't reach his eyes. At first I tried to rationalize it. Anyone who commutes regularly in Mexico City knows the metro is full of unusual encounters, but when the train stopped and I stepped out, he stepped out too. That's when things began to feel uncomfortable. I was heading to the university that day, which meant transferring twice. Every time I changed lines, there he was, always somewhere behind me or across the platform, never rushing, but also never losing sight of me. And eventually he started talking. His voice was soft and almost reassuring, which somehow made his appearance even more disturbing. He told me he had seen it too, and that what I'd noticed on the tracks wasn't a person. I tried to ignore him, assuming it was leading into some kind of pitch, and I was right. He began talking about a temple where they could supposedly teach people how to heal others. He said some of us were more sensitive and capable of noticing things, and most people couldn't. I politely declined. A few stations later he asked me again. By the time I made my first transfer, he had tried several times to convince me to go with him. What unsettled me was how little it sounded like persuasion. It felt more like he was reminding me of something I'd already agreed to do. He never gave a specific address. He only mentioned vague references, saying people knew about these temples, healing centers, whatever you wanted to call them, somewhere between Tepito and La Merced. The way he said it made it sound like common knowledge. That detail stuck with me because early that day I had stopped by La Lagunilla. I was young and smoking weed back then, so naturally my brain searched for rational explanations, and maybe I was being paranoid or overanalyzing a perfectly ordinary interaction. But still something felt off. Whenever I tried to lose him in a crowd, he would somehow reappear. I never clearly saw him move between spaces, I would just notice him again already there. Then somewhere between stations the lights flickered. It was brief and happens all the time in the metro, but the timing felt creepy. And for a split second I thought I saw a figure outside standing in the tunnel close to the train. When the lights stabilized, I turned back towards the man, but he was gone. No one reacted or looked around. It's as if no one had ever been standing where he'd been. And I remember feeling this deep irrational discomfort that stayed with me long after the ride. Years later, a conversation brought the memory back in a way I wasn't expecting. A former co-worker told me about their time working in a psychiatric hospital in Mexico City. According to them, several patients had described similar encounters in the metro. Calm strangers, friendly conversations inviting to temples or healing groups. Some of these patients didn't describe it as recruitment, but as being taken. Not violently, but guided somewhere they couldn't later identify. A few claimed they managed to get away, but none could clearly explain where they had been. My co-worker had a perfectly logical explanation, of course, delusions, memory gaps. And honestly, that explanation makes sense. But several patients insisted they kept seeing the same people again later in the metro watching them. Every so often when I'm riding the metro and the train slows between stations, I catch my reflection in the dark window and wonder if I'll ever see that creepy man's face again. For context, I work at a heritage railway in the United Kingdom, which for those of you who don't know is a privately owned railway that runs steam engines and older trains for fans and the public to enjoy on railway lines that were previously closed, usually meaning they are very old. The specific station I was at is around 160 years old and is deep within the countryside. There is an unconfirmed story that there have been bodies buried underneath the station from people who died in the early days of its operations. There has been other paranormal activity at this station reported from shadow figures and voices. However, until this incident, I was yet to see anything myself and was skeptical that it was true. It was late into the evening one night, and we were locking up. Bearing in mind, it was in late autumn/early winter, so the sun had far gone by now, and it had become rather dark. I was walking down the platform towards our staff room, a small building located away from the main station building, when I saw what seemed to be a person moving rapidly up the other platform exit ramp. But something was off about them, as they didn't seem to be moving like a normal person, and more floating in a smooth motion. When I glanced back to check what I'd seen, it had vanished. I was a bit surprised at first, but decided that it was just my mind playing tricks on me with the darkness and fatigue. After I returned to the main station building to finish tidying up, me and a colleague turned the light off in the waiting room, closed and locked the windows, and locked the door. At this point, we had finished locking everything up, so went to the staff room to collect our belongings. Once we left the staff room, we were all walking back past the station building as we heard the waiting room light being switched on. Bear in mind, this is an old dolly-style light switch, so it's very audible when being turned on. The sound causes us to turn around as the waiting room light comes back on behind us. Thinking this may be some electronical interference, we unlocked the waiting room, and the light switch had been moved into the on position. We switched it back off, locked the door, and walked away again. As we got back to our cars, we looked back at the station to once again see the shine of the waiting room light, although this time we were too far away to hear the light switch on. Going back once more, we found the switch had been put into the on position while there was nothing in the room and all entrances were locked. We switched it down once more before swiftly leaving, all slightly freaked out at this point. As far as I know, this hasn't happened before, and has yet to happen again on the many evenings I've been there. There was definitely a strange feeling in the air that evening, and the combination of the thick darkness and thick countryside and the eerie silence occasionally broken by animal noises added to the creepy ambience that night. This event was witnessed by 2 other people who all repeat the same story as me. 2 years have passed and we've had a few more encounters, there with some ghostly apparitions appearing on security cameras and strange noises, but nothing quite like that night. A few years ago when I was 18, my cousin and I had a very extraordinary experience that we can't explain. It was around 1:15 a.m. The streets were mostly empty, and the town had that hollow quality to it that you notice after midnight. Neither of us could sleep, so we drove out for food and decided to walk a bit after to kill time. For context, I've always struggled with anxiety and disassociation. I tend to zone out a lot, especially when I'm tired. My cousin knew this about me. He used to joke that I half lived in another dimension. But he was also used to snapping me back to reality when my attention drifted too far. After eating, we parked near a small shopping strip and cut through a narrow path behind a local food stall. The shortcut ran alongside some railroad tracks. During the day it was completely harmless. At night, though, it had an unsettling liminal atmosphere. We were in the middle of some forgettable conversation, when I noticed a silhouette near the tracks. At first, it barely registered. It looked like someone standing there hunched forward, not sitting or crouching, but standing. The figure's head was tilted downwards, its back slightly arched and completely motionless. I didn't react right away. My brain immediately tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone checking their phone, or someone drunk, someone trying a shoe. I mean, people do strange things late at night, and nothing about it initially screamed danger, and we kept walking. Then the figure shifted. It wasn't a dramatic movement, just enough for it to step into the reach of a nearby streetlight, and that is when the unease hit me. Something about its proportions didn't sit right. The arms looked longer than they should have been, not exaggerated or cartoonish, but subtly wrong. I slowed without realizing it. My cousin noticed immediately and asked what was wrong. I don't know. The closer we got, the stronger that uncomfortable feeling became. The figure didn't move naturally, it seemed to unfold rather than step, shifting in small, unsettling motions that were both jerky and somewhat fluid. Under the light, its skin, or what I could see of it, looked grey. That's when my body reacted before my mind could catch up. A cold, instinctive dread washed over me. I stopped walking and said one word to my cousin. Run. My cousin didn't question it. The second he heard the change in my voice, we both bolted. Adrenaline drowned everything out, our footsteps slamming against the pavement. And like an idiot in a horror movie, I looked back. The figure was no longer hunched over. It was moving, but not towards us, but towards someone else, a man on a bike that was slowly pedaling down the street. What unsettled me most was that he didn't react. He didn't speed up or swerve, he didn't even seem to acknowledge the figure approach him. Meanwhile, the thing moved with those same unnatural arm positions, upper arms angled downwards and outwards, forearm jutting forwards in a stiff, almost mannequin-like pose. Within seconds, it was practically on top of him. My cousin grabbed my arm. "Dude, what the hell is that?" "I don't know," I said. The biker simply kept moving at the same slow pace, still swerving slightly. There was no panic or hesitation or awareness whatsoever. Then just as we reached the corner, he abruptly changed direction and rode south, disappearing down the street. And the figure remained near the tracks, like nothing had happened. We didn't stay to investigate. To this day, we still debate what we saw. My cousin insists it was probably just a person distorted by bad lighting, someone standing strangely, someone carrying something, and that our brains misinterpret shapes in the dark. And I wish that were true. But every time I replay it in my head, I know it's not. Last Wednesday night, I was heading back home to New Jersey after spending the evening in Madison Square Garden, where I'd gone to watch a New York Knicks game. Instead of heading straight home, I stopped by a nearby club and stayed there for a few hours, unwinding and enjoying the night. I had a few beers, nothing excessive, and paced myself. But by the time I left, I felt that light, loose buzz. Eventually, reality caught up to me, and I knew I had to get back, so I made my way into Penn Station to start a trip home. The place was quieter than usual, especially for New York, but not completely empty at that point. I took the New York City subway, riding the one train for just one stop to Times Square, then got off and started walking towards the Port Authority bus terminal to catch my bus back to Jersey. And that is when things started to feel off. When I got to the terminal, it was eerily empty, far emptier than it should have been for that hour. There were no crowds or random people passing through. I remember thinking it was strange, but not enough to stop me from continuing forward, and I just kept walking, trying to get to where I needed to be. Then out of nowhere, I felt a hard shove from behind. It hit me so suddenly that I didn't even have time to react before I lost my balance and slammed onto the ground. The impact knocked the air out of me, and before I could even process what was happening, it got worse. I felt multiple impacts almost immediately, kicks coming from different directions, 3 people at least. I could feel their shoes hitting my back, my stomach, even my head as I tried to curl up and protect myself. It all happened so fast, maybe 15 seconds total, but it felt much longer in that moment, like time had stretched out just enough for me to register every hit without being able to stop any of it. I didn't fight back. I was completely caught off guard, disoriented, and focused on just trying to shield myself. Then just as quickly as it started, it stopped. I felt someone tug at me, and then my wallet was gone. The footsteps moved away fast, and by the time I managed to lift my head and look around, they had already vanished. I was left there on the ground, breathing hard, trying to figure out what had just happened. My whole body hurt. My head was spinning, but somehow my phone was still in my pocket, and that was the first thing I reached for. My hands were shaking as I pulled it out and hit the power button 5 times, triggering the emergency call. When the operator picked up, I could barely get the word out at first. My voice was unsteady, my breathing uneven, but I managed to tell them I'd just been attacked and robbed. They told me help was on the way and to stay on the line with them while I tried to keep myself together. While I was still lying there, I turned my head slightly and noticed something on the ground nearby. A pocket knife. One of them must have dropped it during the attack. Seeing it sent a chill through my gut, because it made me realize how much worse things could have been. They hadn't used it, but they could have, and if they had, I don't know if I'd still be here talking about it. The police and EMTs arrived in under 5 minutes, though it felt longer. By that point, adrenaline was starting to wear off, and the pain was settling in more clearly. They helped me up, asked me questions, and then rushed me to the hospital to get me checked out. I stayed overnight giving statements to officers and investigators while they documented everything. The next day I was released, and finally made it home, still sore and shaken but alive. I lost about $300 that night, along with whatever else they might have tried to use from my cards. And yeah, that sucks. It's not a small amount of money, and dealing with the aftermath of cancelling my cards, talking to banks, following up with investigators, it's a headache I'm still dealing with. But at the end of the day, none of that matters as much as the fact I walked away from it. I grew up in Missouri. Moberly was just another dot on the map. Brick buildings, railroad tracks, and cornfields stretching out. I'd lived there my whole life, gone to the same high school my parents did, and driven the same back road since I was 14. It started during my junior year, late fall. I walked home most days instead of taking the bus. It cut through a shortcut behind an old abandoned building near the tracks that everyone called the feed mill, even though it hadn't been used in decades. One afternoon, I heard footsteps behind me and slowed down. There would be this thing where kids liked to scare each other back then, but these steps were uneven, like whoever was walking didn't know how long their stride was supposed to be. Sometimes I'd hear dragging, other times sharp taps like bone on concrete. Well, I'd turn around and there'd be no one there. So, a little bit freaked out, I hurried home, and couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me. After that, it happened more often. I'd catch movements in windows that reflected the street behind me, something tall and pale that vanished the second I looked directly at it. Teachers would call my name in the hallway, but when I answered, they'd swear I hadn't said anything. Once, I heard my mum call me from downstairs while she was at work, and that's when I started losing sleep. The night I really saw it was after a football game. I was cutting through the same shortcut. The moon was bright enough that I could see the feed mill clearly, its broken windows resembling dark empty eyes, and there was a human shape standing next to it, very thin, with its arms almost hanging to its knees, and its head at an angle that looked painful, with skin that was stretched tight and extremely pale. It couldn't move. It moved, joints clinking softly, and when it stepped forward I realized it had been trying to stand like a person and failing. Each step was a correction. "Hey," it said. That alone made my hand shake so badly I dropped my phone. Then its face pulled into something that might have been a smile. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached my front door, fumbling with my keys. I didn't tell anyone that something was copying me, that it lived by the tracks. I try not to take that route anymore. This was technically my first paranormal experience, although I didn't really think of it until I was much older. When I was a kid of around 7, my family lived in an old house with lots of history. The property had once been part of a small railroad station decades earlier, and although the tracks were long gone by the time we moved in, older neighbors would still occasionally mention that railway workers used to pass through or even stay on the land for periods of time. So it was winter, and like a lot of older homes, ours relied on a mix of heating sources to stay warm through the night, the main one being an old metal wood heater sitting in the living room. If you've ever been around one of those, you'll know they're never really completely quiet. They pop, tick, creak constantly as the metal expands and contracts with the heat, but as the child you have no understanding of that, so every sound it made felt random and, more importantly, unsettling. Well, one night, for reasons I cannot remember, I convinced my parents to let me sleep on the couch in the living room instead of in my bedroom. I remember the space being dim, with most of the light coming from the dull orange glow of the heater, which cast long, shifting shadows across the walls and floor, making everything feel slightly off, even before anything happened. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up to the heating making a louder than usual creaking sound. It was loud enough to pull me out of sleep completely. Still half out of it, I turned my head towards the sound, expecting to see nothing more than the usual metal shifting. What I remembered next is where things stopped making sense. Even now, I've spent years going back and forth on whether it was a dream, a trick of the light, or something else entirely. But at the time it felt completely real. I saw what looked like a small train emerging from the area near the heater. Not tiny like a toy, but not full-sized either, somewhere in between, maybe waist height to an adult. Detailed enough that I could clearly make out the shape of an old-fashioned steam engine and a few carts trailing behind it. I don't remember seeing any tracks on the floor, but there was a strong sense of movement, like it was gliding slowly across the room, as if the tracks were implied. The part that stuck with me the most was the sound. There was a faint, steady chugging noise, paired with a metallic, rhythmic sound, like wheels over rails. It wasn't loud, but in the silence of that room, it stood out enough to make things feel even more real. I froze and then instinct kicked in, and I did what any scared kid would do. I pulled the blanket over my head for a moment before scrambling off the couch entirely. On the other side of the room there was a small gas heater, and for whatever reason my brain decided that being near it meant safety. So I crouched down behind it, peeking out just enough to keep the train in view while trying not to be seen, even though I had no idea what would happen if it were to notice me. The train kept moving slowly, crossing part of the living room, maintaining that same steady rhythm the entire time. And then it was gone. There wasn't any dramatic moment where it disappeared. 1 second it was there moving across the floor, and the next it wasn't. The room returned to what it had been before, dim, and I stayed there for a while, crouched behind the gas heater, trying to understand what I had just seen. Eventually I worked up the nerve to climb back onto the couch, but there was no chance I was falling asleep anytime soon. My heart was racing, and I kept expecting something else to happen, but nothing did. It probably took me a good half hour, maybe longer, before I finally calmed down enough to fall back asleep. What's strange is that I never told my parents about it. Even at that age, some part of me assumed they'd just brushed it off as a dream, and I guess I didn't want to deal with that, so I kept it to myself. And over time it just became one of the memories I didn't think about very often. Years later, after learning about things like hypnagogic hallucinations, especially how common they are in children, particularly in low light and in that half-awake state, I've leaned towards that explanation as the most logical one. Everything about the situation lines up: the environment, the timing, the age, even the way the memory feels slightly detached. But even with that explanation, something doesn't sit right. It didn't feel like a dream in the way other dreams do. It didn't fade in the way most childhood memories tend to either. If anything, it stayed unusually clear. And to this day, if I think about it long enough, I get a chill. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I love me a good train story. I feel like we don't do this topic often enough. And who of you can tell me where I took the video that I played through the whole video? I'd be very surprised if some of you can, although some of you OG listeners might remember my comment when someone asked this many years ago. I can't actually remember when the last time I added this footage was, but I did take it 10 years ago now. Blimey, where does the time go, right guys? At the time I'd only just first started the channel and recorded the footage thinking I could do something useful with it in future. Anyway, I would like to give an extra special thank you as always to my members and patrons whose names you can see on screen. And if you would like extra bonus content, feel free to check out Patreon, where you can find even more cool stuff, like the Haunted Hotels video, which I launched yesterday. But that's it from me. I'll be seeing you guys on Saturday for Cemetery Stories. Until next time guys, stay awesome, and good night.